A town in northern France was reduced to cinders in 1194. Street by street, the fire consumed everything. The cathedral stood in the path of it. 3 days passed before anyone could get close enough to look inside. What they found should not have been there. A piece of cloth, untouched. No scorch marks, no ash, no evidence the fire had reached it at all. The people who witnessed it did not debate what it meant. They made a decision. Whatever came next had to be worthy of what had survived. What they constructed over the following decades, architects are still arguing about today. Not because of how it looks, because of what it does. Acoustic researchers, neuroscientists, materials scientists. Decade after decade, they keep arriving at the same finding. This building produces a measurable biological response in the human body. Not a spiritual one, a physical one. The path I took to understand this did not begin in a library. It began with a conversation. A colleague of mine works in audiology. She studies the relationship between sound frequencies and human physiology. She told me, without particular emphasis, that the oldest stone structures on record produce frequency profiles that contemporary performance venues spend enormous sums attempting to recreate. Frequencies that alter heart rate, breathing rhythm, brainwave patterns. I asked her to name the buildings. She listed 4. 3 were Gothic cathedrals. The 4th was a stone formation built before written history on a Scottish hillside. I spent the better part of a year trying to understand what those 4 structures had in common. What I found was not mysticism. It was deliberate engineering. And once I understood the engineering, I understood something else. I understood why the version of history most of us were handed left this part out entirely. The Latin word cathedra means chair. Specifically, the seat reserved for a bishop. That is the origin of the word as it appears in official histories. Those histories describe these structures as monuments to religious devotion, expressions of collective faith, houses of worship. And that account is not wrong. It is simply incomplete. There is a layer of meaning embedded in the etymology that almost no one mentions. The Greek root beneath the Latin, kathairane, means to cleanse, to purify. It is the same root that produces the word catharsis, the release Aristotle described watching over audiences in ancient theatres, the physical unburdening that follows an overwhelming emotional experience. The civilization that built these structures did not draw the boundary we draw between healing the body and healing the mind. To them, purification was a single process, achieved through a single set of conditions. Notre Dame, Chartres, Cologne, Canterbury, Salisbury. These buildings were not raised by bishops directing unskilled labor. They were raised by guilds, and the guilds were not trade organizations in any modern sense of that term. They were repositories of knowledge about geometry, about the behavior of sound inside stone enclosures, about how specific wavelengths of light passing through mineral-treated glass produce measurable effects on the nervous system. The men who cut the stone were called Freemasons. Free because they worked with freestone, a fine-grained limestone or sandstone that could be cut cleanly in any direction. But the freedom in that name carried a second meaning. These men moved across borders, between cities, between kingdoms. They answered to no single lord, no single church. They carried everything they knew inside the structure of the guild itself. The apprenticeship lasted 7 years. What passed between master and apprentice during those 7 years was never committed to writing. It moved person to person, generation to generation, a living transmission of accumulated observation about how materials behave, how structures breathe, how spaces alter the humans inside them. Now, here is the point at which the official record and the physical measurements stop agreeing with each other. Researchers studying Chartres Cathedral have confirmed that the decay time of sound inside that building, the interval between a sound stopping and silence returning, runs to approximately 5 seconds. That alone is unremarkable for a large stone interior. What is not unremarkable is what happens to the frequency distribution inside that decay. The building does not treat all frequencies equally. It preferentially amplifies a narrow band between 40 and 60 Hz. 40 to 60 Hz is below the threshold of most musical instruments. It sits beneath the range most people consciously identify as sound. You do not hear it the way you hear a voice or a chord. You register it as a feeling. Neuroscience literature, published over the past 2 decades, has identified this frequency band as the range associated with the theta state of neural activity. Theta, the brain pattern linked to deep, restorative calm, to significantly reduced cortisol, to documented pain reduction in clinical settings. The building was not beautiful in any incidental way. It was producing a measurable shift in the neurochemistry of every person who stepped inside it. A researcher at the University of Huddersfield has spent more than a decade mapping the acoustic behavior of ancient and medieval structures. His work on a famous prehistoric stone formation demonstrated that the original arrangement of stones would have generated standing waves, producing a distinctly disorienting, altered perceptual state, the kind of state that ancient communities would have recognized as sacred, as transformative. His analysis of Gothic cathedrals found the same deliberate acoustic architecture at work. The flying buttress, which architecture students learn about as a structural solution that allowed thinner walls and wider windows, functions simultaneously as an acoustic deflector. It redirects sound waves back into the interior. It shapes the frequency environment inside the building with the same precision as the stonework shapes its silhouette. Medieval builders did not own frequency analyzers. They had no oscilloscopes. What they had was centuries of careful watching. Generations of builders who had observed how human beings responded to different configurations of stone and glass and proportion, who refined the design each time, who passed the refinements forward. The knowledge lived in the guild. It did not exist anywhere else. This is the part of the history that becomes difficult to sit with. Between 1536 and 1541, the English crown systematically seized and dissolved the monastic institutions. The official account positions this as a religious and political conflict, which it was. But measured in land and infrastructure, it was something larger. The crown absorbed somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of all land in England, and with it, everything those institutions had supported: the craft guilds, the hospices, the almshouses. 5 centuries of continuous care for the sick and the poor. A detailed historical study of the English Reformation documented what disappeared in specific terms. Not just the monks, not just the ceremonies, the hospitals. England supported approximately 500 religious hospitals in 1530. By 1550, fewer than 50 were still operating. 90%. In 20 years. The cathedral complexes had never been purely spiritual spaces. They were the primary medical infrastructure of medieval civilization. The records that survived, and many were deliberately allowed to decay or were actively destroyed, describe herbal gardens maintaining hundreds of medicinal plant species, dormitory wards for the sick, running water systems built for sanitation, dietary practices refined across generations of observation, and at the center of it all, always, the cathedral, the space where frequency, light, geometry, and chemistry converged to produce a physiological state that contemporary medicine is only beginning to map with precision. The glass in those windows has its own story. The history we inherited describes it as narrative, biblical illustration for populations who could not read. That account is accurate as far as it goes, but the glass was doing something the official account does not describe. Material science research has confirmed that the specific mineral compounds used to color medieval stained glass produce an interior light spectrum measurably different from natural daylight. The deep red glass, produced using copper oxide, transmits light in a range with documented effects on serotonin production. The cobalt blue glass transmits in frequencies associated with melatonin regulation. We established this with spectrometers. The medieval glaziers established it by watching what happened to people who stood in that light. For generations. They adjusted the formulas based on what they saw. The dissolution of English institutions was only one chapter. The suppression of the guild system ran across the whole of Europe over 2 centuries. It accelerated as centralized nation-states tightened their grip on commerce and labor. In France, an edict issued 13 years before the Revolution abolished the guild system outright. In England, the legislation that had governed apprenticeships and wage standards since the 16th century was dismantled incrementally through the early 19th, with its final provisions struck in 1814. Acts passed at the turn of that century made worker organization for collective purposes a criminal matter. One by one, the legal scaffolding that had allowed the guilds to function was removed, and with each piece removed, the knowledge those guilds carried became harder to transmit, and then impossible. Here is the pattern I cannot reason my way around. The suppression of the guilds and the emergence of industrial wage labor occurred in the same decades as the transformation of what cathedrals were understood to be. The physical structures did not change. Their function, as the culture understood it, did. The hospitals were gone. The guilds that understood the acoustic and optical engineering were gone. What remained was the stone shell, repurposed as a purely devotional space, the healing function excised quietly from the description. By the 19th century, when the historical narratives most of us still use were being written, the proposition that a stone building could produce measurable physiological effects would have sounded like superstition. The scholars of that era believed in machinery, in wages, in processes that could be observed and reproduced. The idea that craftsmen 8 centuries earlier had possessed an empirical understanding of the human nervous system, an understanding their own era had already destroyed, did not fit the story those scholars were telling themselves about progress. A Bulgarian chemist spent 30 years analyzing the chemical composition of incense burned in Orthodox Christian services. His findings, published in a peer-reviewed journal in 2008, confirmed that burning frankincense resin activates a specific protein receptor in the nervous system, one with measurable anxiety-reducing effects, measurable pain-reducing effects. The Church had been burning frankincense for over 1,000 years before that mechanism was identified. The people burning it did not know the name of the protein. What they knew was the result. They had watched what happened to sick and suffering people who breathed that compound inside a reverberant stone space, filtered through colored glass for an extended period. They had been watching it since the buildings were first raised. I am not arguing the church was a pharmaceutical operation with a stone facade. The faith was genuine, the devotion was genuine, the conviction that what people experienced inside those buildings came from something divine. That was genuine too. What I am arguing is that the effects were equally real, and that the people who designed and constructed these spaces understood the effects through observation accumulated across generations and built them in deliberately. That understanding, practical, transmissible, held collectively within the guild the knowledge of how stone and mineral glass and sound and chemistry interact to produce documented changes in the human body, was not lost gradually. It was not lost through neglect. It was removed through a specific sequence of legal acts, economic restructuring, political consolidation, carried out across 2 centuries, beginning with the seizure of the monasteries and ending with the legal elimination of the guild system across Europe. The question I return to is whether any of that sequence was unplanned. The same decades that saw the guilds dismantled saw the construction of the first patent frameworks, legal architecture that converted knowledge from a collectively held resource into private property. The English Statute of Monopolies in 1624 is recorded as a foundational moment in intellectual property law. It was also the beginning of a legal environment in which the operating model of the guilds, collective knowledge, apprenticeship transmission, refusal to disclose to outsiders, became structurally impossible. In 1817, a prominent American statesman was denied access to the rulebook of a Philadelphia carpenters' guild. By then, that refusal was almost ceremonial. The world being constructed around those men had already made what the rulebook contained irrelevant. The people who built Chartres raised a structure in 26 years that has remained standing for 8 centuries. The nave reaches 37 meters. The walls are almost entirely glass, held by stone ribs and external buttresses that have required no modern reinforcement. The building survived 2 world wars, multiple upheavals, centuries of northern European weather. When contemporary engineers analyze the stonework, they find tolerances that compare favorably with 20th century construction standards. No computers, no laser calibration, guild geometry, empirical knowledge carried forward through human transmission across generations. And embedded inside that construction, a measurable transformation of the biological state of every person who entered it. Through sound, through light, through chemistry, through proportions, the nervous system processes before the conscious mind has formed a single thought about them. We cannot replicate this, not for want of instruments. We have instruments those builders could not have imagined. We cannot replicate it because the knowledge system that made it possible was methodically disassembled. The 7-year apprenticeship that carried empirical observation across generations, gone. The guild that held the accumulated understanding of how sound travels through stone, how light shifts through different seasons, how material and proportion and chemistry interact in the body of a building, gone. The living connection between a builder and the structure he was raising, severed. When wage labor replaced the guild, when patents replaced collective knowledge, when the factory replaced the lodge, something left that has not come back. We can measure the frequencies inside Chartres today. We can run the glass through a spectrometer. We can confirm, with instruments, that the building does precisely what its builders designed it to do. We just cannot build another one. The knowledge of how died in the suppression of the guilds, 2 full centuries before the instruments existed to show us what had been lost. An audiologist I know visited Chartres last year. She brought a portable frequency analyzer and a decibel meter. She stood in the nave for 20 minutes taking measurements. Then she set the equipment down, sat in one of the old wooden chairs, and said nothing for a long time. When she came out, she said, "Whatever they were doing, it works." The questions do not go away. Why do the acoustic properties of a 12th century stone building match the specifications a modern neurologist would draft if asked to design an optimal environment for pain reduction and stress relief? Why was the knowledge of how to produce those effects held inside a guild system? And why was that guild system dismantled by the same governments that was simultaneously centralizing control over currency, land, and labor? Why do we call it a church when the measurements tell us it was something else entirely? A machine for healing, built by people who understood the human body in ways we are only now confirming with instruments, and taken apart by people who understood exactly what they were removing.